Chances are, at some point in your life, you've gotten into the great debate over whether a tomato is a vegetable or a fruit. And the answer might surprise you. While botanically tomatoes are a fruit, well, so is a zucchini. But most nutritionists consider them to be a vegetable, as does the United States Supreme Court, which settled the legal discussion in the landmark 1893 decision Nix versus Hedden. But regardless of the great debate, you also might not realize that if you buy a tomato at the store today, it's probably quite different than a tomato you would have bought at the store, say, 60 years ago. Among other things, it probably doesn't taste as good. And that's because tomatoes were forever changed by an invention that most people have probably never seen nor thought anything about. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The Second World War affected many things, from the development of radar and jet engines to the wide use of plastics to computers and communication systems to medical breakthroughs such as penicillin and blood transfusions. Simply put, your life is much different today because of technologies brought about by the war, but the effects weren't always so direct, and not all of the technologies that resulted were made for the military. Take, for example, the humble tomato. Jesse Kratz of the U.S. National Archives wrote in 2023, the Bracero program was a federally sponsored labor program that was initiated following negotiations with the U.S. and Mexican governments. Officially called the Mexican Farm Labor Program, it was created to address the U.S. labor shortage caused by World War II. The program was created by executive order in 1942 and permitted millions of Mexican men to work legally in the United States on short-term 6 to 12-month agricultural and railroad labor contracts. While the official title was the Mexican Farm Labor Program, the Mexican workers were called braceros, a Spanish word for laborers who work with their arms or hands. The need for workers was real and continued past the war. Kratz explains that when World War II ended in 1945, the Bracero program was renewed, but Mexican laborers were restricted to agricultural work. Most migrants traveled to the Southwest and the West Coast of the United States, working primarily on farms in California. The program faced many problems, but continued until 1964, when the Institute of Oral History at the University of Texas at El Paso writes, the Bracero program ended due to intense pressure from unions, the mechanization of the agricultural industry, and public awareness of inadequate working and living conditions. Over its 22-year run, the program had brought in more than 4 million workers. But the termination of the program created its own challenges. While some agricultural production had seen a decreased need for farm workers due to mechanization, at least one crop had resisted the trend: tomatoes. The magazine Boom California explains, the main problem was the tomato. While varieties could be easily manipulated through seed selection and crossbreeding, no tomato existed that could withstand the violence of mechanized cutting, separating, sorting, and loading. Some tomatoes were too soft and squished on contact with the cutting blades that detached the stalks from the ground just below the soil. Others were too fixed on the vine and refused to separate when pulled into the machine's internal shaker, turning to sauce instead. And even when a tomato could make it through those rigors, it failed to move regularly up the conveyor belt, or its skin thickness wasn't quite sufficient to withstand the eventual hurl off the harvester into the tight compression of waiting bins. It's not that no one was trying. The University of California at Davis Department of Plant Sciences explains. When plant breeder Jack Hanna and engineer Kobe Lorenzen, two scientists at the University of California, Davis, teamed up in the mid-1950s to invent a machine that could mechanically harvest tomatoes, no one thought that they could do it. While mechanization was occurring all over the agricultural industry, the Bracero program had stalled the idea with tomatoes, where the entire idea of mechanical harvesting offered so many problems that it simply didn't seem worthwhile. UC Davis continues, it was cheap and efficient to pay farm laborers, many of whom were brought into the country from Mexico through the Bracero program. These guest workers harvested tomatoes by hand in much the same way that workers in places pick fresh tomatoes today, very gently. Hanna, who went by the nickname Jack, was a plant scientist who never finished his Ph.D. because, he told UC Davis in an oral interview in 1978, he was working on California's Ryer Island, where there was no opportunity to do the sort of experimental work that was necessary for graduate work. Ryer Island is known for its asparagus crop, but as the asparagus crop is harvested in spring and early summer, that left him without work to do for part of the year. The man who would later become famous for tomatoes only became interested as a backup. He told the Oral History Project, "It looked like I needed something else to fill in for the work, since most of the asparagus work was completed by the 1st of July or shortly thereafter. Therefore, I began working on tomatoes as a second crop." The work that he was doing for the university was typical of plant sciences, studying crop varieties, developing disease resistance, and cultivation methods. But he said he hadn't thought about mechanical harvesting. In fact, he had worked on mechanical harvesting for asparagus, but work on that had been, he said, a dismal failure. The asparagus industry continues to face challenges with mechanical harvesting even today. When he began working on tomatoes, he said, I had no idea of working on the tomato harvesting problem. It was, however, an encounter with Albert Jongenneal, a California farmer who had developed a successful sugar beet harvester, that changed his mind. Hanna said that it was Jongenneal who had suggested that Hanna work on mechanical harvesting in 1942 as he had some tomatoes and couldn't get any pickers. And while Hanna's initial response was to tell him why that was impossible, Jongenneal had responded, with all the brains that were up here at Davis and all the tomatoes from all around the world, there must be some way of putting them together and coming up with a tomato that could be harvested mechanically. The challenge was significant. Despite Davis having a large collection of tomato varieties from around the world, Hanna still struggled to find one suitable for mechanical harvesting. By the end of the summer of 1947, he said, after I'd really been looking at this for some 5 years, I hadn't arrived anywhere at all with it. Everett Rogers, a professor of rural sociology at Ohio State University, wrote in the third edition of his book, Diffusion of Innovations. The chief researcher was G.C. Jack Hanna, a specialist in vegetable crops. He took the lead in breeding a hard tomato variety that could be machine harvested, despite the vigorous opposition of his colleagues and administrators, who believed that his idea of mechanically picking was ridiculous. In fact, they feared that his bizarre project would damage the reputation of their department and of the University of California. Part of the difficulty was for another simple reason. As no one had so far developed a tomato harvester, Hanna didn't know what characteristics were required of a harvestable tomato. Hanna turned to UC Davis mechanical engineer Kobe Lorenzen. Lorenzen had worked on orchard heaters that would help the citrus crop withstand freezes, as well as mechanical harvesters for onions and apricots. Lorenzen told the Oral History Project, we were the first to bring together two different disciplines on a single project with a single goal. But the two had difficulty finding success. UC Davis writes, the laughingstock of the Davis Plant Science Department for more than a decade, the two made countless prototypes that failed. Tomatoes split and turned to juice in the field, and the machine broke down after hitting clods of dirt. But after years of struggle, a new imperative came. The Bracero program was coming to an end, and California tomato growers had no good source of labor. UC Davis writes, the tomato industry broke into a cold sweat over the prospect of losing 80% of the cheap labor force that they had used for tomato picking. With the industry on the line, UC Davis continues, in a dramatic tale of perseverance and ingenuity, Hanna and Lorenzen achieved the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. The industry quickly pinned their hopes on the rickety machine and the new, tough, easily destemmed tomato hybrid affectionately named VF-145 that scientists were developing alongside it, in hopes that it would withstand a mechanical harvester. The tomato is sometimes called the square tomato because its somewhat blockier shape helped to keep it from rolling off the machine. The machine certainly raised questions. Journalist Mark Kramer described the machine in a 1980 edition of The Atlantic. It's 2 stories high, rolls on wheels that don't seem large enough to straddle a wide row of jumbled and unstalked tomato vines. It's not streamlined. Gangways, catwalks, gates, conveyors, roofs, and ladders are fastened all over the lumbering rig. Its front end snuffles up whole tomato plants as surely as a hungry pig in a farmer's garden. Its third end excretes a steady stream of stems and rejects. And between the ingestion and the elimination, 14 laborers face each other on long benches. They sit on either side of a conveyor that moves the new harvest rapidly past them. Their hands dart out and back and forth as they sort through the red stream in front of them, culling what is not quite fit for pizza sauce, the greens, bolds, mechanicals, and the odd tomato-sized clod of dirt which has gotten past the shakers and screens that tug tomato from vine. The title of his article was The Ruination of the Tomato. And to be sure, the machine had its difficulty. Rogers notes that the first machines, produced in 1961 by Hanna's friend Ernest Blackwater, a farm machinery manufacturer who contracted with the University of California, had many technical problems. At first, 18 broke down immediately, and of the 7 remaining machines, only 1 completed the harvest season successfully. However, he notes that the machines were more successful in 1962, harvesting 1% of the crop, and then 3% in 1963. Studies showed that mechanical harvesting reduced harvesting costs by nearly half. But then, Rogers writes, the big boost occurred in 1964, when 224 tomato picking machines brought in 25% of all tomatoes grown. Why the dramatic increase? In 1964, the Bracero program ended. While the program that came as a result of World War II had protected the tomato industry from mechanization, its end had made it an imperative. 6 years later, Rogers writes, 1,521 of the machines harvested 99.9% of the tomato crop. But there was a price, as Carolyn Thomas, a professor of American Studies at UC Davis, explained in 2015. In order to be successful, the plant scientists had to think first about the physical properties of the tomato as it passed through the machine, rather than thinking about it as a crop destined for markets and mouths. For the thing to work, Hannah had to prioritize compatibility with industrial harvesting and shipping systems over flavor. UC Davis writes, with an eager network of financiers and UC cooperative extension agents, the California processing tomato industry mechanized almost overnight. Within 5 years, 99.9% of the industry was using the mechanical harvesters, and most farmers were planting the comparatively tasteless hybrid tomatoes built to withstand them. And processing facilities retooled their systems, received the mechanically harvested fruit, reversing the practice of paying premiums for hand-harvested tomatoes. It was a remarkable change in the industry. Kramer wrote, the joining of vegetable crops integrates the farming operation with the marketing, processing, and vending operations so closely that it takes teams of lawyers to describe just where one leaves off and another begins. Today, the cannery tomato farmer has all but ceased to exist. Seems a lot of change to move to comparatively tasteless hybrid tomatoes. So much for the tasty tomato, Kramer concludes. The tomatoes might be less tasty, but at least they could be harvested. UC Davis notes, nearly all the tomatoes grown in the U.S. for tomato sauce, paste, ketchup, juice, and other processed foods are harvested by Hannah and Lorenz's once-scored machine. Luckily for the industry, Hannah's new variety landed in foods where it would be seasoned with plenty of sugar and salt. In one telling of this story, the technological breakthrough saved an industry in California that almost certainly would have moved to Mexico as the Braceros returned home. Time magazine wrote in 1967, farmer Brunel Harlan, 60, is part owner of a pair of $22,000 tomato harvesters. Goes so far as to credit the machine with saving the tomato industry for California. But the effects went beyond corn syrup in your jar of spaghetti sauce. First, there were the jobs. Rogers writes that, and 32,000 former hand pickers were out of work. Then there was the consolidation. UC Davis notes, the new harvesters were expensive and required a lot more land to make a profit. In the first 5 years after the machine's release, 4,428 of 5,000 tomato growers went out of business, a whopping 82% consolidation in the industry. This consolidation so affected farmers that, UC Davis notes, in 1979, a group called Community Alliance with Family Farmers sued the University of California on grounds that the tomato harvester in particular, and UC's agricultural research program in general, violated the 1887 Hatch Act, which provided federal dollars for agricultural research intended to support family farming. The suit continued for a decade, but was ultimately unsuccessful. Then there were the farms themselves. Rogers notes tomato growing moved out of California's San Joaquin County into Yolo and Fresno counties, where the soil and weather conditions were more ideally suited to mechanized farming. That is, mechanical tomato harvesting means that a different tomato is grown by different and far fewer farmers in a different place. Before the mechanical harvester, American consumers preferred soft tomatoes. But today, consumer advocates suggest that at the store you avoid soft, mushy tomatoes. A good tomato should be firm, but give slightly to pressure. Of course, the impacts aren't uniformly bad. Not only did mechanical tomato harvesting preserve the industry in the United States, but it allows a much greater volume of production, which increases employment opportunities down the road for things like shipping and distribution, and lowers the cost of the fruit or vegetable. And the fact that they don't taste quite as good offers its own kind of opportunity. As UC Davis notes, it's created a sort of local food revolution, the farm-to-table movement, where small growers can still do okay by growing and selling, say, heirloom tomatoes that taste better. But it leads you to wonder, did it all have to develop this way? Because Rogers asked this question, what if Hannah and Lorenzen and Blackwater had not been forced to rush their machine into production because of the end of the Bracero program? If they'd had more time for R&D, then might they have developed, for example, a smaller machine that more of the 4,000 or so growers at the time could have afforded? Then might we all be eating, different tomatoes grown by different people? I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.